Mr. President, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had a very important hearing last week regarding the 2001 authorization for use of military force, the law that served as the legal underpinning for the war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I'm grateful for our witnesses, Secretaries Mattis and Tillerson, for making themselves available to members of the committee and for the straightforward and honest answers that they provided for us. Now, as we've gotten further and further away from the 2011 attacks that resulted in the passage of the 2001 AUMF, I've urged Congress to take a fresh look at that authorization. When 4 soldiers died recently in Niger, I think most Americans and even some members of Congress were shocked to learn that we even had troops in that country. Our troops were not there under the auspices of the 2001 AUMF, but considering that they were reportedly ambushed and killed at the hands of an Islamic State affiliate, questions have been raised about where our forces are and where they are at war with terrorists versus when they are simply conducting train and equip or other missions of that sort. It was encouraging that nearly every member of the Foreign Relations Committee was in attendance at that hearing, where the witnesses testified that the administration believes that it has ample authority to prosecute the war on terrorism and does not need a new AUMF. I can't say that I was surprised to hear this testimony. No administration, Republican or Democrat, will ever willingly concede or cede the broad authority given to the executive branch 3 days after the September 11 attack. If they were to say that we need new authorization, they would concede that they hadn't been acting with authorization all this time. So they're never going to say we need a new AUMF. But what has surprised me is that there are members of this body, the Senate, who are content to let this 16-year-old authorization remain in place. Some have even suggested that any updates to the AUMF can be made using the appropriations process. Are we really going to start using policy riders on annual spending bills to approve of sending troops into harm's way? We rarely even vote on individual spending bills anymore, let alone controversial policy riders to those spending bills. Are we truly willing to leave it to the members of the Appropriations Committee to update a law that has put our service members into harm's way, particularly those of us on the authorizing committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? I hope that we more jealously guard our prerogatives than that. Our inaction on updating the 2001 law has already relegated the role of the Senate in authorizing force to that of a cog in a feedback loop. I would submit that we in the Senate ought to aspire to be more than that. For 16 years, Congress has been all too willing to let successive administrations use those broad authorities to address new threats and to deploy U.S. troops in new places. Beyond Afghanistan, our troops have deployed all over the world to places like Yemen, Philippines, Somalia, and Libya to fight al-Qaeda and its affiliates. We've also sent forces to Syria and back to Iraq to defeat ISIS, a group that didn't even exist in 2001. Now, we need to fight terrorism overseas, and I'm not suggesting that the U.S. should shy away from these battles. To the contrary, I believe Congress should do its duty in supporting these missions by voting to authorize them. In the 16 years since the passage of the 2001 AUMF, approximately 300 members of the House who voted on it are no longer in that chamber. In the Senate, only 23 senators remain in their seats today, those senators that voted on the original AUMF. That leaves approximately 70% of the entire Congress that has never cast a vote to authorize military force abroad, and yet, over the years, deployments have continued to new places, combating new foes. The U.S. is strongest when we speak with one voice. Therefore, Congress must have some buy-in on these missions. Our allies and our adversaries need to know that the war on terrorism has the support of Congress. More importantly, our troops need to know that Congress is behind them. I know the concept of passing a new, updated AUMF is a tricky one. This is not a conventional war against a sovereign nation in which victory is easily defined. Instead, we're fighting an ideological enemy that has no sovereignty, and which over the years has moved all over the world, resulting in many splinter factions that can change their names at any time with ease. This new kind of war requires a new kind of authorization, one that allows Congress's continued buy-in and increases its oversight. Right now, we have neither of these. Now, after working on this issue for several years, Senator Tim Kaine and I have introduced legislation that we think gets us in the right place. Our bill would authorize the use of military force against al-Qaeda and the Taliban and ISIS. It authorizes force against affiliates to those groups and requires the President to report to Congress when he initiates force against a new group he designates as being associated with al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or ISIS. Military operations can begin as soon as the President has notified Congress. There is no time lapse required. If Congress doesn't agree with the President's designation, our bill allows a 60-day time frame during which any member can bring a resolution of disapproval to the floor under expedited procedures. An adoption of such measure by both houses would result in the end of military operations against that group. Our bill adopts the same process with regard to geography to allow Congress to disapprove of military operations in a particular country. Now, I recognize that traditional declarations of war and other authorizations of military force haven't referred to a particular geographic area in which operations can take place. But all of our previous military engagements were against sovereign nations with armed forces, not terrorist groups that can pop up in any country at any time. If Congress is going to authorize the use of force, we ought to know which countries the U.S. troops are operating in. Now, requiring the President to notify Congress when he begins operations against one of these terrorist groups to a new country is an important check on the executive branch to ensure there is no overreach. And the bar for disapproving the President's decision is high, appropriately so. It would require 2/3 of the House and the Senate to disagree with the President on his decisions with regard to new associated forces or new countries. Right now, Congress has very little to say over who or where our military fights. The only option available is to cut off appropriations, and history has demonstrated that that simply is not realistic or appropriate. The most recent example of this, as some of my colleagues will recall, was in 2011 when the Obama administration joined the NATO operation to help rebels in Libya topple Muammar Gaddafi. The administration never made the case to Congress as to what U.S. interests were served by U.S. involvement, and as a result, many members on both sides of the aisle publicly opposed our intervention in Libya. And yet, when the clock ran out on the time constraints set forth in the War Powers Resolution, Congress did not turn off appropriations, because you can't just pull the plug when you have underneath service members when they're in harm's way overseas. The, quote, turning off appropriations, unquote, simply hasn't worked in the past, and it's not likely to work in the future. We need real congressional buy-in and oversight over a conflict that has morphed considerably since 2001, and which we are now being told is morphing onto a new continent. S.J. Res 43 gives us just that. I should note the bill also includes a 5-year sunset. A sunset is not intended to serve as a notice that the war on terrorism will end in 5 years. It's there to require a new Congress to put its skin in the game by voting on authorizing force. Now, the administration has signaled its objection to this provision. They think that the war on terrorism could be undermined if terrorists think that they just have to wait us out. I worry more that the lack of congressional buy-in undermines the war right here at home. 70% of Congress has no skin in the game at all. We're free to criticize the President, whether the President is Republican or Democrat. That's not right. We ought to have responsibility here. We're the Article I branch. We're the branch tasked with declaring war and authorizing the use of force. We shouldn't shirk our responsibility. We can't let history repeat itself and go for another 16 years without voting for the use of force against terrorists. That's why I support a sunset on any new or updated AUMF. Now, perhaps the best feature of the Flake Kaine measure is that it is bipartisan. That is an essential feature. I think we can all agree that passing an updated AUMF along party lines is perhaps the only worse thing than letting the status quo remain. Mr. President, I commend the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Chairman Corker, for signaling that we will move ahead with a markup of a new AUMF. I think that Flake Kaine is a great start, but I'm under no illusion that in the process of putting a bill together that can garner widespread bipartisan support, I don't think that will be an easy one. But the longer we wait, the higher the risk becomes that we will render ourselves irrelevant when it comes to authorizing force. That is a risk that the Senate and the Congress should not take. With that, Mr. President, I yield back.